The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "A rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward.' The steward said to himself, 'What shall I do, now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes.' He called in his master's debtors, one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' He replied, 100 measures of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, 'And you, how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 cores of wheat.' The steward said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones, and the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If therefore you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will you trust with true wealth? If you are not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can have two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I don't remember a lot about what I learned in my homiletics class when I was in the seminary. But I can bet there was some semblance of these 3 rules at play. Number 1, never start your homily with a dumb joke. 2, never insult a person or a group of persons unnecessarily. And 3, if you're going to break the first 2 rules, that joke better be really funny. Well, please allow me to break all 3 of these rules with one full swoop. So, there was this guy in a bar, and he leans over to the guy next to him, and he says, "Do you want to hear an accountant joke?" The guy he's speaking with replies, "Well, before you tell that joke, you should know that I'm 6'2", 200 pounds, and I'm an accountant." And the guy sitting next to me, he's 6'4", 240, and he's an accountant too. Now, do you still want to tell that joke? And the first guy thinks for a minute, he says, "Nah, I don't want to have to explain it twice." I know, it's a terrible joke, and surely not worthy of this august crowd and venue. Unnecessarily offensive, too, to accountants everywhere, many of whom I like, and who certainly don't deserve such treatment. But I couldn't help it, because although it broke the rules, this joke vaguely points in the direction of what I want to say about God and about the gospel today. And it's important to say this, and it's simply this: God is not an accountant. Now be patient, this will make sense in a minute. Friends, as we move from summer to fall, and as our students and your kids are settling back into school or resettling here into Notre Dame or whatever grade school, high school, or college they attend or their job, and as things get busy and more intense for all of us at work again, and football season is in full swing, and life gets back to its regular non-summer pace, we may be pondering a lot of things, like tuition bills, or the price of football tickets, or the scores we have to get on our tests, or the markers we have to hit at work, or whatever. And sometimes life can seem to be taken over by our calculators or our computers. Yet the theme of today's gospel is that our salvation is not a matter of calculation at all. God is not a bookkeeper, not an accountant. The way we handle money and other resources is important for sure, but it's not finally what really matters. What really matters is God's uncalculating love. In truth, I have always had a difficult time with today's gospel. In fact, I would argue that it's one of the most difficult passages in all of Scripture to interpret. There have been more explanations of it than the 100 measures of oil owed to the master. The story is commonly called the parable of the unjust steward. In it, Jesus seems to commend practices that Amos thunders against in today's first reading. Dishonesty that exploits the poor, and the violation of the sacred duties of justice. Is Jesus really recommending dishonesty and injustice? Jesus tells the story of the steward or manager of a certain rich person's land, someone like the chief operating officer for a large corporation. An audit has revealed that he has been squandering the resources of his master's estate, and he is called on the carpet to explain himself. Realizing that no defense is possible, the manager devises a plan. By reducing the debts owed to the master, he hopes to gain favor with the debtors so that they might hire him later. So he calls them in for some negotiations. One owes the equivalent of 100 barrels of olive oil, and the manager cuts the debt in half. For another who owes many bushels of wheat, he reduces the debt by 20%. Shockingly, the parable concludes by saying, the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. What? He commends him for acting prudently? He sounds a lot like a crook to me. But there's an explanation. And the most common one of this parable is that Jesus is not praising the dishonesty of the manager, but his prudence in handling a difficult situation. In discounting their debts, the steward was probably only giving up his own generous commission. Such a deal won him great favor with the debtors, and since he acted as the landlord's chief financial officer, such a deal made the master look very generous and forgiving towards those who owed the money too. Surely everyone would praise such a generous landowner as the town hero. And since the master could not undo the steward's cancellation of the debts without losing face, and thus making his debtors resent him, he praises the steward for outwitting him. It's a sadly cynical scenario, I think, but it does make some logical sense. There may be some truth in this interpretation, but this one and the others sometimes seem far-fetched. The landowner just doesn't seem much like the God Jesus has helped us to know, the one he's been preaching and teaching all this time. Only recently have I run across an interpretation that makes good sense to me. It's important to note that this parable in Luke's gospel immediately follows the story we heard last Sunday, the parable of the prodigal son. Both parables portray a person facing a life-threatening situation, and both because the central character has squandered resources. Last week, it was the son who squandered all that he had received from his father. Today, the steward has squandered the resources of his landlord. Last week, the story began by saying a certain man had 2 sons, suggesting that the central figure is the father who welcomes his son home with no questions asked. So last week's story could just as easily have been called the parable of the generous or forgiving father, and not the parable of the prodigal son. In a similar way, today's story begins by focusing on a certain man who was rich. So the central figure in today's story could be thought to be the master or landlord, not the steward. The central focus ought not to be on how the steward maneuvers his way out of difficulties, but perhaps on the fact that the master offers him unexpected acceptance. The steward is rescued from danger by what he receives, not by what he accomplishes. So we could appropriately call this the parable of the uncalculating master, rather than the unjust steward. In this scenario, since the master symbolizes God, Jesus is telling us that God cancels debts, independent of all machinations. God is not an accountant who keeps precise track of all the successes and failures. No, God welcomes us back and loves us without calculating how much we have done right or how much we have done wrong. This, my friends, is enormously good news for us. We have a God who loves us unconditionally and so crazy generously. But it's important, too, to note, especially in the midst of such a glorious revelation, that this doesn't dismiss us from the deep responsibility to use well the gifts God has given us so generously. Indeed, God's loving kindness and incalculable generosity ought to be what compel and inspire us to live with a like generosity and kindness. St. Ambrose, the 4th century bishop, talked about this true wealth that we have been given by a God who loves us. The bosoms of the poor, the houses of widows, the mouths of children, he says, are the barns which last forever. This is where we should store up our treasures. The bosoms of the poor, the houses of widows, and the mouths of children. True wealth consists in not what we keep, but in what we give away. Jesus makes clear in this parable and in the subsequent chapters of Luke's gospel that our hearts must either be possessed by God's love or our hearts will be possessed by the love of something else. Friends, the image that God is the keeper of the book of life, in which all our failures and achievements are written, is present in nearly all religions. And if we are honest, it will be difficult for any of us to take much comfort from thinking we'll be judged by what has been written in that book. But today, Jesus is telling us that God, while he expects us to use his generous gifts well, does not finally keep score that way. Our God, as Pope Francis continually reminds us, is a God of mercy and compassion. He is not an accountant, but an uncalculating, incalculably generous giver of gifts. This good news can set us free from many anxieties. It can enable us to serve each other with generosity and justice. This is the good news for which we give thanks around the table of the Lord today. So let's celebrate God's generous, loving, and uncalculating mercy.